Somewhere inside you there is a locked room, and here's the part nobody warns you about. Not one single person on this earth is allowed to walk in there with you. Your best friend can't get in. Your therapist can't get in. Even the partner who has held you through your worst nights can't get in. They can stand at the door and listen while you describe what's behind it. But the real mending happens only when you're standing in there, solo, unseen and unreachable. This is the one thing almost nobody says out loud about getting better. It's why some people spend years in counseling, buy every course, chase every guru, and still wake up feeling unchanged underneath it all. They've spent their whole lives pounding on that locked door, praying somebody else would swing it open for them. Nobody ever will. That door only opens from your side. Carl Jung figured this out long before most in his profession even considered it. Early in his career, he trusted the same assumption his peers held, that the doctor was the source of the cure, that transformation was born in the bond linking healer to patient. Then his entire framework collapsed. Around 1913, Jung entered what he'd later call a direct reckoning with his own unconscious, a stretch of unraveling so severe he privately wondered if he was losing his mind. And what surfaced during that plunge caught him completely off guard. None of his teachers could follow him down there. Every outer relationship he'd built had zero access to what was happening inside him. The peers he once admired quietly assumed he'd cracked. He stood entirely alone in that space, and the sole way forward cut through the middle. Whatever he found on the far side of that isolated struggle became the bedrock for everything he taught afterward. He began treating his patients in a new light. He began seeing his own life differently too. Slowly, he arrived at an understanding of healing that ran almost opposite to what the psychiatric establishment had preached for generations. Today I want to walk you through what Jung discovered about mending yourself without leaning on anybody else. 3 questions frame everything ahead. Why does chasing outside rescuers actually trap people deeper inside the very injury they're desperate to escape? What is the inner authority, that part of you that must take command before real change can begin? And what is the singular kind of labor he found that nobody else can perform for you, no matter their skill or devotion? Let's begin with what Jung noticed about how people typically approach their own healing. He spotted a familiar pattern in nearly every patient who came through his door. They arrived in pain, but the way they described that pain gave something away. They pictured themselves as broken, and they cast him as the fixer meant to repair them. They walked in carrying a silent assumption that he'd shoulder the labor, that he'd name the problem, hand them a prescription, and eventually rescue them from whatever was eating at them. Jung understood exactly where that assumption came from. This habit of searching outward for repair takes root in early childhood. When you're small, you genuinely need another person to calm your nervous system, to soothe you, to help you understand what's happening around you. The grown-up handles what the child cannot handle alone yet. That's healthy, at that stage of life. That's precisely how a young nervous system learns to find its own order. But somewhere in that process, things can go sideways, and for many people, they do. If the grown-ups around you were unable or unwilling to do that steadying work, if your caregivers were checked out, overwhelmed, or simply incapable of meeting you where you stood, then some piece of you froze in place, still waiting for somebody, anybody, to finally arrive and provide the steadying that should have happened back then. That waiting doesn't stop when you grow up. It only changes targets. You start scanning romantic partners, counselors, mentors, teachers, sometimes total strangers, carrying that same buried hope. This one will be different. This one will finally give me what nobody gave me when I needed it. Jung watched this dynamic play out again and again with his patients, and he was blunt about the trap it built. For as long as a patient believed the cure was flowing from him, that patient stayed frozen in the posture of a child waiting on a parent. Sure, they might gain insight, they might feel temporary relief, but the deeper architecture of dependency stayed intact underneath it all. At bottom, they were still waiting to be rescued. They'd simply upgraded to a more impressive authority figure to wait on. Here's what made Jung's insight so significant. He realized that this exact pattern, this hunt for an outside savior, was often the core wound itself, not merely a byproduct of one. The patient's fracture wasn't purely a result of childhood events. It came from surrendering their inner authority to people who never had the capacity to carry it, and then surrendering it again, over and over, in grown form, to whoever seemed credentialed enough to absorb the projection. This is the private room nobody else can step into for you. The room where waiting ends, where you reclaim the authority you surrendered, before you grasped what you were giving up. Jung's own collapse gave him first-hand knowledge of exactly what this involves. During his breakdown, he arrived at the point where every familiar source of support fell quiet. His bond with Freud had already broken apart. His footing in his field felt uncertain. His usual methods for locating himself within the world were slipping away beneath him. He confronted a choice: seek out a fresh outside authority instead, another mentor, another theory, another circle of people willing to affirm him, or walk into that room by himself and see what waited there. He picked the second path, not from bravery, but because everything else had run out. What awaited him there rebuilt his entire grasp of the psyche. Something inside him already knew, not his ego, not his upbringing, not his trained intellect, something far deeper that, the moment he stopped hunting for answers outside himself, started handing them to him from within. He named this force the self, the organizing intelligence that holds the conscious mind and stretches well beyond it. Once he stopped reading his own collapse through inherited theories and instead simply stayed with whatever was rising, images started appearing, memories, symbols, full exchanges with figures he hadn't deliberately created. These inner figures carried messages worth hearing. His unconscious was actively communicating, and once he grew capable of hearing it, he became a genuine participant in his own recovery in a way no outsider ever could manage. This marked the pivot point. Recovery wasn't something delivered to him from outside. It grew from a bond he cultivated with his own inner depths. And that bond, the private one, was the sole connection able to reach the actual injury. This didn't push him toward concluding therapy was worthless, or that human bonds carried no weight. He kept practicing his profession, kept seeing patients, kept treasuring his nearest relationships for the remainder of his life. But he entirely reshaped his sense of what those bonds could and couldn't deliver. He came to view the best a skilled therapist could offer as a form of midwifery work. They could set the conditions, clear some space, steady someone through their descent. What they could never do was the actual work. That labor was internal, and only the patient could carry it out. This is the piece of Jung's thinking that gets the least airtime in mainstream psychology, and it might be the most crucial. Most suffering people are running on the wrong assumption. They believe finding the perfect helper, the perfect method, the perfect framework will finally deliver their healing. And they keep coming up disappointed because the psyche doesn't operate that way. What actually works, based on Jung's decades of clinical observation, is far harder than locating the right person. It means learning to give yourself what you've spent your life waiting for somebody else to give you. Learning to show up for yourself the exact way you kept hoping someone else would. Learning to sit inside that room and remain there, even when it feels unbearable. This is precisely where most people quit, because the room earns its reputation honestly. Inside, it sits everything you've been outsourcing, every emotion you couldn't sit with solo, every memory that needed outside help to make sense of, every fragment of yourself you split away because you couldn't carry it alone. All of it waits in there. The second you step inside, all of it rises up to greet you. Most people walk in, feel the weight of what's there, and immediately walk back out. Off they go, chasing a different helper, a fresh distraction, another relationship to hide in. Anything to dodge sitting solo with what they've been lugging around for years. Puzzled, they ask themselves why nothing ever shifts. But a smaller group, usually because they've run through every other option or something within them, finally refuses. Stay in that room, past the initial discomfort. What they discover, in staying, is that what once felt impossible gradually turns bearable the instant you stop running from it. The pain itself doesn't vanish, but something new grows in you while you remain with it. A capacity, a kind of inner muscle, a specific quality of internal steadiness that wasn't there before. Jung named this growth the rise of the transcendent function, his own term. The phrase reads academic, though the idea beneath it was practical. He meant developing the ability to hold two opposing states at once, without collapsing into either, to feel the wound directly while remaining anchored as you feel it, to experience the chaos rising from the unconscious while your footing in ordinary awareness stays intact, to sit with what's difficult without instantly needing someone else to soften it for you. This capacity is what healing meant to him, not erasing pain or reaching some lasting plateau of comfort. He meant becoming a person who could stay present with themselves even through the hardest parts, and discovering that this presence was the very thing they'd been chasing in everyone else their whole life. Before we go deeper into how this works in practice, one quick note. If what I'm describing is hitting close to home, if you're spotting that pattern in yourself, the waiting, the outsourcing, the reaching outward for what only you can construct within, we put together a guide that might accompany you through this kind of inner work. It's called Inner Ground, 24 reflection prompts pulled from Jung's model. Links below if you'd like to check it out. Moving on, because there's a method Jung worked out that deserves your attention. The technique Jung built for the unconscious carries the name active imagination. Most descriptions make it sound otherworldly or overly technical, when honestly it's neither. At its heart, it's a method for entering that room on purpose, settling in and learning to stay present with whatever surfaces without steering it and without bolting. In practice, it's easy to explain and hard to do. You carve out time. You let the usual noise of your thoughts quiet down. Then you wait. You don't force anything to occur. You don't try to solve anything. You allow images, sensations, memories, fragments of conversation to surface on their own. Whenever they arrive, you remain with them a while. You let them unfold. You ask them things. You let them answer back. This feels odd because we're taught to treat the mind as a machine we operate from the control panel. Most modern self-help rests on the notion that pure logic can talk you into calmer moods, that you can reason your route to relief, push past old habits by willpower alone. Jung found this approach seals the wound where it sits, because it operates purely from the ego, that conscious, directing part of the psyche. The injury rests below that layer, untouched. The unconscious runs on its own inner logic, and it speaks through images, sensations, symbols, felt experience, not the tidy logical language the ego prefers. When you attempt to fix yourself purely by thinking, you're trying to mend a wound in one tongue using tools made for another. It doesn't land. Active imagination is the practice of training yourself to listen in whatever tongue the unconscious happens to use. You take a seat, you let it arrive, you take whatever surfaces seriously, even when it makes no logical sense. Gradually, a different kind of relationship starts to form, one with yourself at a depth ordinary daily awareness usually glides right past. Jung insisted this is not a passive activity. It's not idle daydreaming. It's not escapism. It demands sustained focus and a distinct brand of honesty. Whenever something surfaces, you must face it. When an inner figure voices something uncomfortable, you must take it in. When a buried feeling emerges that you've sidestepped for years, you must remain with it until it's genuinely felt. This, right here, is work no one else can shoulder for you. A therapist narrates what's unfolding. A book can offer you frameworks. A teacher can gesture toward a direction. But the true sitting, the true listening, the true willingness to stay in that room when every cell of you wants to run belongs to you and only you. It's precisely what reshapes you when nothing else manages to. Jung noted something particular about the people who took this practice seriously across years. They grew what he called an inner companion, not a literal voice issuing instructions, but a felt sense of walking alongside something within, wiser than their day-to-day mind, a presence that understood them more fully than any outsider ever managed. This inner companion was never fabricated. It was unearthed. It had sat there the whole time, patient, until they quit hunting for an external stand-in for it. The instant it became genuinely real to them, something shifted across every other relationship in their life. They stopped grasping at people. They stopped trying to squeeze out of others what those people could never provide. They could stay connected without sliding into dependence, love without needing rescue back. They could let people get close without losing themselves. This is the element Jung viewed as most crucial. Doing this healing work quietly and alone doesn't strand you in isolation. It's precisely what makes real, lasting connection possible at last. Because the earlier version of you, endlessly leaking, grasping, hoping some relationship would eventually patch you up, was never truly capable of connection. It could only need, full stop. And need, whatever disguise it wears, isn't love at all. Someone who has truly done the inner work doesn't need the other person to act a certain way just to feel settled. They've already established that settledness inside their own private room. From that footing, they can encounter other people as they arrive, not as raw material for what they need them to become. This is the odd self-sufficiency Jung saw in his most developed patients. They weren't distant. They weren't dodging closeness. They had simply become so anchored in themselves that they stopped bringing an endless craving into their relationships. Once that craving stopped steering it, the bond could finally turn genuine. There's a worry worth naming that surfaces almost every time somebody hears this idea. There's an anxiety that this work amounts to giving up on people, that pulling back from dependence dooms you to permanent isolation, that this room somehow works against real connection. Jung addressed this directly, since he saw this anxiety show up again and again with patients. He observed that a fear of solitude usually turns out, underneath, to be a fear of sitting alone with your own contents. That dread isn't tied to other people being gone at all. It's about confronting your own presence. People surround themselves with constant noise because that inner room feels unbearable. Relationships end up functioning like a thermostat, keeping your internal climate manageable so you never feel it head-on. Once relationships stop carrying that job, you find your own inner climate can, in fact, be endured. It isn't always pleasant, it's rarely simple, but it can be endured. And once you've built the ability to ride out your own storms, other people no longer owe you a particular way of behaving. Which means, oddly, you can be present with people without the hidden motive of needing them to hold your regulation steady. This is the depth Jung pointed toward with individuation. The goal was never becoming some walled-off unit, needing no one. It was about your center of gravity settling inside yourself, so connection becomes a choice rather than a survival reflex. A person like this doesn't require solitude, though they can handle it. They don't require relationship, though they can handle that too. The need no longer runs things. He concluded this was the only kind truly equipped to love well. Love born of need always tows a quiet demand behind it. You need the other person to keep behaving a certain way, so your feelings stay contained. You need them to meet your needs in exactly the right shape. You need them never to change in ways that unsettle your balance. That's love, bound up with an unspoken order to keep tending you. Love from individuation has a distinct texture. It lets the other person exist as they are. It lets them develop along paths you didn't pick. It lets them keep their own depths, their own private room, their own labor to do. Your sense of being fine no longer hinges on their behavior. You forge that inside your own room. And from that place, you're able to hand them the same freedom you gave yourself. So how does a person actually get started with this work? Jung named clear specifics on a handful of things that matter here. The first is that you must be willing to sit with discomfort, not occasionally, not in tidy, manageable portions, but as an ongoing practice. That room holds everything you've been dodging, and walking inside means feeling all of it. There's no way around this. Any method promising healing minus discomfort is peddling something false. Genuine change means sitting with what feels bad and finding you can withstand it. The second point, you form a relationship with whatever comes up, rather than scrambling to correct it. When a feeling rises up inside you, the instinct is usually to push it away, distract yourself, analyze it until it dissolves. Hunt for a strategy that resolves whatever's triggering it. Jung's method took another route. He'd ask, what's happening here? Where's this rooted? What message does it carry? That questioning treated the feeling as real communication from a piece of yourself you typically tune out. The third is that it has to be a habit. A single moment of crisis intervention won't do it. Your inner world remains shut to visitors who only stop by occasionally. It unlatches for those who keep coming back, who demonstrate over months that they're actually going to stay. The bond you build with yourself grows exactly like any other bond, through repetition and staying power. There's no shortcut around this step. You either show up for yourself or you don't, plain and simple. Whatever grows from there hinges entirely on that one choice. The fourth requirement is a specific brand of honesty. It's the private kind, where you quit lying to yourself about your real feelings, about what you actually crave, about what you've truly been doing to keep alive the very habits you insist you want gone. This honesty is rare, and it stings, and it's the one thing that builds the right conditions for the unconscious to unlock. It refuses to trust a self that won't level with itself. When all four pieces come together, willingness to endure discomfort, relationship with what surfaces, steady practice, and honesty turned inward, something begins to stir that Jung struggled to capture in plain language. The psyche starts organizing itself. Patterns you've fought your whole life begin loosening on their own. Connections you couldn't previously see become visible. The fragmented inner figures begin knitting into something less broken apart. There's nothing mystical about it. It's simply what unfolds when you finally shoulder the task you were destined to confront eventually, rather than holding out for someone else to handle it in your stead. Jung observed that those who committed to this seriously developed what he called a wholly different relationship to their own suffering. He never claimed suffering would vanish altogether. He made clear that life carries loss and disappointment and pain, regardless of how deep your individuation runs. But their relationship to that suffering transformed entirely. It stopped being something that simply befell them and turned into something they could genuinely sit alongside. It stopped splintering them and started shaping them instead. It stopped standing as evidence that something had gone badly wrong and folded into the fabric of a lived life. This comes as close as Jung ever got to naming what true healing looks like. Building a self able to carry difficulty without breaking apart. The only path to that self cuts straight through the room, through the toil nobody else is able to carry out for you, through the slow, uneasy discipline of remaining present with yourself in the way you'd once hoped somebody else would show up and be. If you've stayed with me this far, something inside you is probably recognizing all of this. Notice that old habit of hoping. Notice the pieces of you that kept expecting somebody else to eventually step up and finish the labor sitting there waiting on you. Notice, maybe for the very first time, that you're the only one able to cross that threshold. There's a form of grief folded into that noticing, and a form of freedom tucked inside it too. Grief, since it involves releasing a hope that's quietly shaped large stretches of your life. Freedom, because as soon as the waiting ends, you're free to actually start. All the energy that once fed the searching now stands ready for the real work, and that work is what genuinely transforms you. Jung never claimed this path would be easy. He never promised non-stop happiness or some permanently elevated state of bliss. What he discovered, across decades watching people walk this road, was something far more grounded. He found that people who committed to this labor grew into fuller versions of themselves. They stopped fighting against their own nature. They grew able to face their lives with exactly the kind of steady presence that living actually demands. No matter what pain arrived afterward, they could remain with it without being shattered by it. That's what's on offer here. It isn't a glamorous one. It doesn't come dressed in the sort of guarantees the wellness world is fond of selling. It simply comes with the slow, genuine possibility of becoming somebody who no longer needs anyone else to hand them what they can finally give themselves. The room is still there, exactly where it's always been. It's been there your entire life. The door was never actually locked. It only ever felt that way while you waited for someone else to open it for you. Nobody is coming to walk through it on your behalf. Nobody is going to complete the work sitting inside waiting for you. But the moment you finally cross that line, you'll find you're far less alone in there than you dreaded. That inner companion has been waiting on you as well, and the bond formed with that piece of you, the piece Jung called the self, the piece that recognized you from day one, turns into the connection that at last hands you what you'd spent years hunting for in other people. That's the mending no one else has the power to give you. And it's the healing that, once truly rooted, cannot ever be stripped away from you afterward. If any part of this has struck something in you today, if you can sense that room and feel the pull to finally step inside, hit like and let us here at Surreal Wisdom know it landed. And if you want a hand actually stepping into that room, our companion guide, Inner Ground, has 24 reflection prompts built to walk you through exactly this kind of inner work. Links below.